The BBC developed as a regional radio broadcasting station in the early 1920s, just as the BBC was being established as a national service in London. And in its first few decades, it was run as a station that was operated mostly by Englishmen who took the feed from London and broadcast, basically rebroadcast the national program. There was, in the early years on the radio program, there was very little programming focused on Northern Ireland. And that only came later. It developed in the 1930s, and then during the war years, once again, the national program came to dominate. It's interesting, after the Second World War, the Labour government tried to get all of the different regions to develop more programming on their own and wanted to see autonomy promoted, both in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, as well as in Wales. In Northern Ireland, it was problematic. The Northern Irish government at Stormont was worried about a regional service that would have a representation from the entire community and might begin broadcasting programs that it defined as problematic. Before the outbreak of the Troubles and before the advent of television in Northern Ireland, the notion was that any mention of divisions within Northern Ireland would simply be avoided. The Unionist government was able to control the advisory board inside of Northern Ireland. It was able to prevent the broadcast of any programs that addressed the grievances of the Catholic community, and it was also able to make sure that partition was really never addressed. In fact, much of the programming that was defined as Gaelic, that was focused on Irish traditional music or any aspect of Irish culture, was avoided, and only British programming reflective of British culture was broadcast. Now, in 1959, the BBC began broadcasting its television program inside of Northern Ireland. And once again, through most of the 1960s, the BBC avoided anything that was seen as contentious. It was mostly rebroadcasting a program from London. Slowly but surely, news and current affairs programs began to be featured that were developed inside of Northern Ireland. And initially, these once again avoided anything to do with controversy within Northern Ireland, with the notion that there were divisions in society. But this changed with the outbreak of violence in 1969. And one of the reasons that it changed was because when the Civil Rights Campaign developed, the civil rights campaigners had, for the first time, understood the power of television. Beginning in 1967 and 1968, many of the leaders of the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association were university-educated men and women who had been watching television and especially become aware of programs that covered the civil rights movement here in the United States. They understood the power of television and the power of images. And so in 1968 and 1969, the civil rights campaigners in Northern Ireland began to try and reach out to an audience that was outside of Northern Ireland. They regarded the government inside of Northern Ireland as incorrigible, and they were trying to make a case to London, to the Parliament, that their civil rights were being denied. They were arguing that they didn't have universal suffrage. And so the rhetoric of the civil rights campaign was, one man, one vote. And they were very much influenced by what had taken place on this side of the Atlantic. They understood that if they could get into news and current affairs broadcasting on the national network, that is from London, that they would get the attention of Parliament in London. And they hoped that their grievances concerning discrimination in voting, in employment, in housing would be addressed. Well, once NICRA, or the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association, began to march, it gained the attention of the BBC in London, and reporters were sent from London, from what was known as the mainland, to Northern Ireland to cover the Troubles as they were developing, and this embarrassed the government at Stormont in Belfast. They became concerned with the images that were being broadcast. And these images were, usually of peaceful protests being broken up by the police, oftentimes with baton charges, water cannon, and this created a good deal of concern in London. The British were upset because the image of Great Britain was being, as they believed, tarnished by these images. And London began to put pressure on the regional government at Stormont in Northern Ireland to initiate changes that would address the grievances of the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association. So the civil rights campaigners were successful in getting the attention of London. The London government again began to put pressure on the government in Belfast to initiate changes. And this created tension within the Unionist government. There were many hardliners who believed that the Civil Rights Association was made up of Republicans and anarchists out to destroy the state, and they didn't want to cave in, as they saw it, to the demands of the Civil Rights Association. So the Prime Minister at the time was a man named Terence O'Neill, and in the 1960s he walked a tightrope, trying to address the concerns of the civil rights campaigners because he was under pressure from London, all at the same time trying to keep his own party together and trying to make sure that the Unionist Party would not splinter over this question of granting civil rights within Northern Ireland. The BBC did a very good job initially in covering the outbreak of the unrest in Northern Ireland. A number of young, ambitious journalists made their way to Northern Ireland and were interested in getting beyond the statements issued by the regional government there. They began to go out and interview people, especially Catholics living in ghettos in Derry and the Bogside or in West Belfast. And they began to look into questions of discrimination. They especially began to look into the way in which housing was allocated, public housing, and their programs addressed the discrimination that they discovered there. They also began to look at gerrymandering in a city such as Derry. Derry had a population that was over 60% Catholic, but the city council or the corporation was dominated by the Unionists. And the more investigative reporting that was done by these London journalists, the more unsettled the government in London became. And that's why pressure was exerted on the Stormont government to initiate changes. So initially, the BBC did a very good job at reporting on the realities inside of Northern Ireland. The television coverage caused acute embarrassment for Labour governments and Conservative governments alike. They were very uncomfortable with the images that they saw coming out of Northern Ireland and embarrassed, especially on the world stage. The British like to see themselves as, the sort of epicenter of democracy, as a nation that could teach the world a great deal about democracy and how it functioned. And these protests and the behavior of the police caused real embarrassment and forced the government in London to put pressure on Terence O'Neill and his successors to push meaningful changes forward that would address the grievances of those involved in this campaign for civil rights. Well, initially the police were not all that accustomed to television, and they behaved very, very badly. They were seen in television footage going into crowds with their batons, attacking peaceful civil rights campaigners. Once the Battle of the Bogside broke out in 1969, once there was an uprising in Derry and that spread to Belfast, and the British Army arrived on the streets of Northern Ireland, that began to change things. The British government became very concerned with the way in which the British Army was being portrayed and the questions that were being asked about policies inside of Northern Ireland. Initially, the British government was obsessed with making sure that journalists would see the British Army as intervening in Northern Ireland to try and keep the peace. But slowly, many Catholics who had initially welcomed the British Army into Northern Ireland because they offered protection to their communities, slowly the Army was seen as protecting or propping up a government at Stormont, that is the regional parliament in Northern Ireland, which was incorrigible. And they came to resent the army, and they would see the army as siding with that government and basically just supporting the police. And the BBC journalists began to understand this. They began to see that the Catholic community in Northern Ireland was becoming alienated from the British Army and was seeing the British Army as simply a tool of the Unionist government. And when journalists of the BBC started to report this on news and current affairs broadcasting, it caused great concern for the British government, who began to try and put pressure on the BBC to cease broadcasting these programs that were questioning British policy or British tactics inside of Northern Ireland. Well, by the time Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, the troubles had been ongoing for a decade. She had become very critical of BBC coverage, and her spokesman, when she was out of government, her ally was a man named Ari Neve. Neve was assassinated by Irish Republicans in 1979, just as she was embarking on her campaign to become Prime Minister. And she believed that the BBC had an important role to play in the struggle against terrorism in Northern Ireland. She grew increasingly alarmed at BBC journalists who were either interviewing members of the IRA or who were trying to get programs onto the BBC that were looking at the complaints of the Catholic community, the complaints against the British security forces, against the army, as well as against the police forces. And so she decided by 1988 that the BBC had to be reined in. She believed that the BBC was supporting the terrorists inside of Northern Ireland, and therefore she instituted what became known as the broadcasting ban. And that stated that no party that seemed to support the subversives in Northern Ireland, be it Republicans or Loyalists, could be interviewed. And it was mostly Republicans, mostly Sinn Féin, which was seen as the political wing of the IRA, which was banned from the airwaves. Now, that meant that the voices of people like Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness could not be heard by viewers watching BBC television or heard by those listening to radio broadcasts. So the BBC tried to push back. Many of the journalists and managers and broadcasters inside of the BBC in London understood that this censorship had to be challenged. So they hired actors, people like Stephen Ray, to read the words that Gerry Adams was speaking. So the Adams dialogue would be muted, and an actor would be brought in to read a transcript of what Adams was saying. This seemed surreal, and it was something that embarrassed the British government, and it made it clear that censorship was functioning in one of the world's most powerful democracies, which of course was something that Margaret Thatcher was not all that thrilled with. In writing this book, I was fortunate to be able to interview a number of people who were working with the BBC in the 1960s and the 1970s. A number of editors of news and current affairs broadcasting, a number of journalists, senior civil servants, Kenneth Bloomfield, who was the senior civil servant in the Northern Ireland office during the time, and somebody who was on the board of governors of the BBC. I was also able to work with primary sources located at the UK National Archives at Kew. I was able to look at the papers of Margaret Thatcher at Churchill College in Cambridge. But most importantly, I was able to get access to the BBC written archives, which are in Caversham, which is in Reading, just outside of London. And the BBC written archives proved to be a tremendously important source for this book. Very few people had looked at this as a resource. And just looking at the notes and the minutes of news editors, of the BBC Board of Governors, of journalists proved really valuable, because it enabled me to get behind the camera, to look at the debates that were taking place within the BBC about what should and should not be broadcast, and about how managers and directors were going to respond to the pressure that came from politicians, from the press, and from society about how the story of the Troubles was going to be told. In the end, I think the BBC did a very good job. They worked in tremendously difficult circumstances to try and get at what exactly was going on in Northern Ireland. And their programming caused tremendous consternation for Labour as well as Conservative governments alike. Much of its program infuriated the unionist community inside of Northern Ireland, who believed that programs that were critical of its policies were simply providing oxygen to the terrorists. But the BBC stood up to the pressure from London, from Belfast, and tried to tell the story about the Troubles as best it could in very, very difficult circumstances. Well, after reading through documents and archives that covered a 30 to 40 year period and interviewing a number of key people involved in trying to report on the Troubles, I've concluded that the BBC did a very good job in tremendously difficult circumstances. The BBC was bullied by politicians. It was under tremendous pressure by the press, by public opinion. And the BBC persevered. They stood up to the bullying, they endured censorship, and they tried to tell the story about what was taking place in Northern Ireland and inform their audience of what was going on in a part of the United Kingdom that the audience lived in. And that, I believe, is what public service broadcasting is all about. Many of these reporters on the ground, managers and editors, as well as directors and directors general, understood that the BBC had a certain ethos, that it had a commitment that it had to live up to, and that it had to inform viewers, sometimes about unpalatable events taking place in Northern Ireland, which of course is part of the United Kingdom.